We also have Powers. Powers is kind of like Gotham Central. It's about just regular cops who work in a city where there happen to be a handful of superheroes and supervillains. So it's really a lot more procedural, a lot more cop-like than Gotham Central. And it's got this sort of dark feel. It's some of the first work by Brian Michael Bendis, who a couple years after that was writing pretty much Marvel's entire line for a while. So he's a big name in comics, and Powers is the place to start with him for sure.
Can I ask you a question, Peter, before we get too far off of like Civil War?
Mm-hmm.
Like, how do you know if I'm trying to have a patron who hasn't started this yet? I mean, are there a bunch, like if I go and look, there's going to be Civil War, it's going to say volume 1, 2. I mean, how do I know where it starts and where it kind of ends?
That's a great question.
Thank you.
My advice is to use Wikipedia.
Okay.
I know that's sort of the worst thing a librarian can say, but our catalog doesn't really deal with it in that way.
Right.
And what's tricky about it too, so we have Civil War, that's the main part of the story. So if they want the main story, it's there.
Okay.
But all the peripheral stories are running through the other titles. What's tricky, technically they're all running simultaneously.
Okay.
Because these are trade paperbacks. So all of Marvel's January stuff is Civil War.
Okay.
So the only way you could really recreate the experience of reading it in order would to be to get like 10 different trades and read one issue of each at a time.
Wow.
So it's kind of tough. But if you Wikipedia Marvel Civil War, it kind of gives you a timeline, and it'll show you everything that's in there, and then people can kind of decide from there. You can also look in the front of every trade paperback. There'll be a page that looks kind of like this. This will give you numbers of what you're reading, so you know exactly what you're reading. It also gives you original publication dates. So that's another way you can do it if you have them in hand. You could say, well, this was published then, this was published next, and that kind of thing.
Okay. And so, how did you know that this was kind of the end of the Civil War part?
Just from reading.
Okay.
Just
from being
fanboy
in it.
knowledge. Yeah.
Okay, got it.
There's no real strong tie to it. That's one of the issues with crossovers, is they kind of have these big crossovers, but then they want to get back to normal afterwards.
Yeah.
So they kind of have to just say like, all right, enough of that, let's move on to whatever.
Okay, yeah, gotcha.
So it's tough to say.
He woke up and it was all a dream.
Exactly, yeah.
So you say use Wikipedia, but what would you type in? You wouldn't type in Civil War.
Marvel Civil War. Yeah, whenever you're searching comics, I would start with either the universe or the character if it's specific. Like Spider-Man is doing a storyline right now called The Gauntlet, so I'd say Spider-Man The Gauntlet, and that would be your best bet.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Oh boy. Okay, why The Last Man? This is a great, great story. No superheroes, we're kind of away from that for right now. The premise of this story is everything's going as normally, and then one day, for mysterious and unknown reasons, all the men on planet Earth die.
Whoa.
Except this guy.
Monkey.
And this monkey, which is also a male. Only 2 males left on the entire planet.
Wow. No other animal males even?
No,
Like
nothing.
horses?
So it all
Nope. Male horse is dead, male dog's dead, all males, anything with a Y chromosome is dead. Except these 2.
Wow.
So, they kind of erupt into this very chaotic world. It's an interesting take because you might think it's like, oh well, flowers, picnics, everything's good. Not so much, it doesn't work out exactly. There are different factions who, when they discover this guy, either want to say like, oh my gosh, we need to do some research and figure it out, and there are others who are like, we don't need men, let's just get rid of them.
Wow.
And then there's everyone in between that spectrum. So it's a really sort of interesting sci-fi kind of thing going on. V for Vendetta. If you've seen this movie,
Hated it.
you hated the movie?
Oh.
What did you hate about the movie?
The end. I mean, just,
The end.
yeah. I was like, really? That's what it, oh.
Fairly bleak
Yes.
kind of ending.
Yes.
That's a pretty common thing from comics from this time period. But part of why I wanted to bring this up, it's by Alan Moore, who's also a huge writer. V for Vendetta, Watchmen, one of his, League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, which I do not recommend the movie, but highly recommend the comic. He's really, in my opinion, one of the masters of comics. He does things, like I was saying, in comics that you couldn't do in another format. For example, you have a page like this, where a character is playing a piano and you see the song going along and you have a scene going on. So this is sort of like in a film, if you had background music going during a scene and scenes. Within these universes, you can all visually. So he does a lot of things that really play with the format. Okay, I'm going to speed things up a little bit. These 3 books are all by the same guy, Robert Kirkman. This is Invincible. The Walking Dead, which you may have heard of, is a new television show that's on right now. Big hit, big zombie book. World War Z and this are probably the best zombie fiction that you'll ever find. Great stories. Starts a little bit like a 28 Days Later knockoff and then quickly evolves into something pretty intense. And also The Astounding Wolfman, which goes along, it's a horror book. Not really for your Twilight fans so much, but what's really different about Kirkman's work is it's got a comic booky, cartoony feel, but it can trick you, and that's part of what I wanted to
Marvel's
bring up
actually,
too,
if you
is
go all the way
see
up,
these bright colors, these clean cut looking characters, and it's like, oh, this is great for kids. Not for kids! I promise you it is not for kids. And he kind of defies that whole logic, though, that comics and bright colors and that kind of thing are for kids. Okay, Sin City. This is Frank Miller again. This is sort of the pinnacle of the darker, noirish sort of stories. A lot of these stories are very bleak, very spare. The characters are rarely very heroic, would I say. Sometimes they do heroic things, but overall, net value, not so great. And what's great about this, too, is the art. The art is absolutely amazing. It's unfortunate we get them in this smaller format. They were originally published in a larger format, more like this. So I think you miss a lot of the real effect of the art to have these big pages like this blown up. So if you can get a bigger copy, I would definitely recommend checking that out. Okay, Astro City and Watchmen. I kind of want to talk about these at the same time. Probably a lot of you have seen or heard of Watchmen. This was Alan Moore again, who's V for Vendetta. He wrote a story that was sort of about DC characters, Superman, Batman, etc., but he takes them to their sort of realistic limit. So for example, Superman is a little too powerful and sort of loses touch with humanity and starts going off into his own world, while Batman kind of becomes obsessed and dangerous. He's the characters, but they're still pretty recognizable. On the flip side, you have Astro City. This is a newer sort of take on superheroes. It's a city where all the superheroes live, but they do also have a connection to reality, but in a more friendly way. For example, superheroes go on dates, or it's different super teams and how the super families get along. So this is like not really about superhero action. It's more about people who are in extraordinary situations. Watchmen, kind of the same thing. So these are sort of the dark and light side of the same coin.
Who is that in the picture?
That? One of the Silver Agents. I don't know. Walking Dead, which we talked about. Another great horror comic, The Goon. The Goon is sort of like, if you're a big fan of Twilight Zone and that kind of thing, if you're real into stories that sort of take you really quickly into a wacky, sort of scary place and then take you back out. Tales from the Crypt, I would say, is pretty close to the general feel of this book. It's also like that in that it's scary but very funny at times too. And the art is also pretty excellent. The artist does some pretty cool painted pieces that you can find in the trees too. BPRD, this is another good horror comic. If you're familiar with Hellboy, this is kind of about, his coworkers. But as you can imagine, they get involved in some very strange and mysterious things. They also have a rotating sort of cast of artists and writers who handle this series. So one story can be pretty different from the next. So like we talked about continuity, it maintains the continuity. This character, something happens to this character and that's maintained through all the next stories, but they can have a pretty different tone and style too as they go. Alright, Wolfman, we talked about Sandman. Probably one of the most famous stories in comic books at this time. Sandman was Neil Gaiman, who you might know from The Graveyard Book or American Gods, or he's written several novels. This was a massive comic project. I think there are 17 or 18 volumes this size of Sandman. And again, it has a rotating cast of artists and that kind of thing. It deals a lot with gods. You know, he's the Sandman, the Lord of Dreams. There's death, fate, that kind of thing. So that you can imagine the range of stories is just incredible. The artwork is amazing as well. And it spans, you know, decades, so it really takes you through sort of comic history and comic trends as you go through the entire series. Fables. This is a newer series. This is a great one if you're just getting into comics because you can start at volume 1, but also you're kind of familiar with most of the characters already. So the characters in this are like the big bad wolf, Jack from the Fables, all that kind of stuff. And the story is they all live in Fabletown, which is away from our place, but then they have to move to the real world. So they have to sort of get along in the real world, but a lot of things come up along with that. For example, there are fables that don't fit in the real world, like Mother Goose. You can't just have a giant goose walking around, that spoils everything. So they have to go live somewhere else, and it becomes kind of a thing of like, how come we can't walk amongst people like you guys can? Kind of turns political. Electric Girl. Great comic for girls and boys. But I wanted to especially highlight some that girls might be interested, because sometimes not as into comics.
And are we still in comics, or have we gone to graphic novels?
Both still.
Okay.
We've been kind of going back and forth, mostly comics though.
Okay.
Electric Girl's got appeal, I think, because it's got sort of simple art, and it tells a pretty simple story, but it does what any good story does. It tells a simple story very well. This girl sort of has minor electric powers, but I wouldn't say she's like a superhero or anything like that. And she has a friend who's a gremlin who no one else can see.
Oh, nice.
And that kind of puts some humor in the situation. This is one of my personal favorite comics, Bone, which was a limited series. This is popular amongst readers of all ages. I don't know what to say about it beyond it's just very charming. I think there are 8 volumes about this size. You can also actually buy the 1-volume set, which is just one big phone book that's got the whole story in it. Although I recommend all the trades pretty much are in black and white, and if you can read it in color, you can see just how amazing the art is. This is fairly kid-friendly too. Maybe not young kids, but I would say like 10 and up will probably enjoy Bone and not be offended. You also have, along with Bone, Rose. This is one of the characters from the Bone universe, a little more grown up. This is also a great comic for girls. It's got very powerful female characters, very realistic sort of female characters. It goes into the fantasy side of things a little more, which I think can be attractive as well. Alright, now we're going to move on to some projects that are a little more graphic novel-y, a little more on the personal side for the writers and artists. Houdini, the Handcuff King. This is by Jason Lutz, who's done a couple other great graphic novels. This is kind of a history of Houdini, a very short biography of what he did and that kind of thing. It's got an interesting color palette that he uses a lot in his comics, and it also shows you some of the details of how he did his escapes and whatnot. So it's got a little extra something in there that you might not be able to get from just reading a book.